Ronnie LeDrew has been puppeteering for over 50 years. In addition to performing at the historic Little Angel Theatre in England, he's worked on films such as Labyrinth, Muppet Christmas Carol, Muppet Treasure Island, and many more. He's probably most well known for portraying the character of Zippy on the long-running show Rainbow. Ronnie LeDrew is my guest on this episode of Under the Puppet.
You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show.
The new Under the Puppet app is here for iOS and Android, and it is absolutely free. Download it today to get all the episodes of Under the Puppet in one place. Plus, you'll hear new episodes before their release, get exclusive bonus episodes, and more. Just search for Under the Puppet in the Apple App Store for iOS or on Google Play. You can also visit SaturdayMorningMedia.com/apps for direct links. The free Under the Puppet app for iOS and Android. Download it today. Welcome to the show that talks to puppeteers about the art and business of puppetry. My name is Grant Pachoco, and this is Under the Puppet. Welcome to Under the Puppet. This episode, my guest is puppeteer Ronnie LeDrew. Ronnie's had an amazing career in puppetry starting all the way back when he was a child. Through the years, he's worked in theater, on television, and in film, including performing in Labyrinth, Little Shop of Horrors, The Muppet Christmas Carol, and more. He's also performed some of the most iconic puppets on British television, from Muffin the Mule to Sweep on The Sooty Show and Zippy on Rainbow. Here's my interview with Ronnie LeDrew. Well, Ronnie LeDrew, it is such an honor to have you here today on Under the Puppet.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sure it's going to be a great pleasure.
I know you began puppeteering in your teens, but before that, do you remember your first exposure to puppetry, like on television or in person?
Well, I think probably it goes back, way back. Actually, can you tell? I'm going to tell you. It was the 1950s, and I was watching with an aunt, and I was on an old black and white television set. And it was a program called Muffin the Mule, which was basically a program that the BBC did. There was just the one channel then, and it was a string puppet dancing on a piano, and there was a presenter who was a lady called Annette Mills, who was actually the sister of quite a famous English actor called John Mills. And anyway, she would be playing the piano, and on would come this funny little wooden marionette dancing away, and he was called Muffin, and he had a lot of friends. He had Oswald the Ostrich, and he had various other funny characters that would come along, and it was operated by a wonderful puppeteer called Anne Hogarth, and she and her husband Jan Bussell founded the Hogarth Puppets way back in 1932, and that was one of the first sort of vague memories I have. I mean, I must admit I was probably about 4 or 5, maybe a bit older than that. But and that was the first sort of venture, I suppose, into puppet theatre. But apart from that, on television, I was also brought up in going a bit forward into the 60s and 70s and stuff. I saw things like, you must know probably Jerry Anderson and his puppet films that were sold, I think, to America as well. But I saw things like Torchy, The Battery Boy. It was a very early series of Jerry Anderson. What else did I see? I saw Twizzle. I think that was the very first one, actually. And then there were other more the sort of science, well, I say the science ones, but the sort of fantasy space ones, which were Supercar, which I loved, and then there was a cowboy, a western one called Four Feather Falls, and these were early black and white puppet films, but they were marionettes again, and they were just fun stories, and I loved those sort of things. But there was also on the BBC, getting away from the Jerry Anderson early films, there were early BBC puppet things. Apart from the Muffin the Mule, there was Sooty and Sweep, which is a glove puppet operated by a man called Harry Corbett. And he had a friend called, Sooty had a friend called Sweep, who was a glove puppet, and he had a sort of squeaking noise. He just whispered into Harry's ear all the time, and Harry did some magic tricks, or Sooty did with Harry. I mean, it was a glove puppet, so he had his other hand free when he didn't have the other puppet on. And eventually, I think Harry's brother, it's very much a family concern, operated the other puppet, so it left him free to do a bit more magic. And that was a sort of 15-minute program, I think, something like that, made in, again, black and white in those days. And then there was things like Bill and Ben, the Flower Pot Men. They were marionette shows, again, funny little characters, and Andy Pandy, and there were several sort of. We actually we had quite a lot of puppets actually on television when I think about it now. So that was my sort of early television, early television and introduction to puppets.
Excellent. Well, there were certainly a lot of them, and some of these names, as we continue this conversation, are going to come back to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when you were growing up, were your parents creative at all?
Not really, not in the sense, in the sort of theatrical sense. I think my father was a science teacher. My mother worked in sort of insurance business. She was sort of secretarial work, that sort of thing. And really, I was actually born in Toronto, in Canada, believe it or not. And we came over with my father basically just after the war, decided that it would be wonderful to get an English degree. He had already got a Canadian degree, and he wanted to teach. That was his sort of ambition in life, and he thought, well, if I get an English degree, that'll be marvellous. And so we left our home in Canada and got the boat over to Liverpool. Took about 3 weeks, and arrived in Southampton. Sorry, did I say Liverpool? We arrived in Southampton. Anyway, and we stayed with an aunt of my mother's in Poole in Dorset, which wasn't that far from Southampton. Then we eventually came to London, and we had various places we stayed at I remember when we got to London, it was about 1953. This is a long time ago. I don't know how I remember all this, but anyway, there you go. We stayed in a house in Fitzroy Road in North London, very near Hampstead Heath, that sort of area. Also, we then moved on to, this is all in a fairly short time span, really. And then we moved to a flat in South London, in Clapham South, and then eventually we moved into a larger flat, which was wonderful, in Stockwell in South London. And there in fact, my mother lived there for 55 years, so that was our residence. And while I was there, that's when I started to sort of think about maybe doing puppet shows or having an interest a little bit, I suppose, more serious, as it were, because I thought I was given, my father actually made me, I suppose he did have an artistic bent, really. He made me a sort of little puppet stage. It was a little bit top-heavy, I remember. The proscenium was made of sort of plaster and stuff. I wish I'd had a photograph of it. Sadly, I don't. But, I did some sort of glove puppet stuff there to the kids that's from in the flats. I mean, we lived on the first floor, and I used to set up my sort of booth, as it were, rather simple affair really, but and I think I had about 5 glove puppets. Sort of, they were bought ones. I didn't make them or anything, and the kids would sit on the stairs going up to the second floor, so it was almost like a raked auditorium. So they had quite a nice view of the stage. And eventually, after that, I moved on to some puppets that you could buy in those days in toy shops. They were made by Bob Pelham. They were Pelham puppets, and he started his career, I think, around about the 1940s, making sets of puppets for kids to play with. And sadly, they were quite expensive as far as I was concerned at the time. So I had about 3 of those, and I had a wind-up gramophone, and I used to wind it up and put on the old 78 speed sort of records and dance the puppets to that. And somehow the kids seemed to like it, and I quite enjoyed it. And then eventually, this is all in fairly over a period of probably over about 10 years. I moved on. I got into early days in secondary school. I decided that I thought I wanted to do something a little bit more exciting with puppets rather than what I'd done before, and so I discovered that there was a little model theatre you could buy, which was a model theatre basically called the Pollock's Toy Theatre, and it was really originated. I suppose it got very popular around the time of the sort of after the First World War, that sort of time, but they were around long before that. And I got a story with the theatre, which was the Regency Theatre, quite small, but you had these cut-out figures, and they were famous for sort of tuppence coloured and penny plain, and if you got the plain figures, you coloured them in yourself, and then you stuck the paper sheets that they were onto thin cardboard, and then you cut them all out, and you had about 20 or 30 different characters, and you had scenes that you coloured in as well, and you put them in. It was just literally a model theatre, and I did eventually get some lighting for it, which was rather simple, but I remember in those days you couldn't get these tiny little lights you can get nowadays, but they were sort of torch battery lights, and I managed to wire them all up. I was quite pleased with myself, I must admit, on a block of wood, and I put them in between the sort of the pieces of wood that the theatre was constructed on before you could put the scenery, and there was pieces in between there. Anyway, that was the sort of overhead lighting, and for giving the sort of coloured effects, I had there was a sweet brand called Rose's Chocolates, and they had lovely coloured papers, and I put those round the lights, and so they had different colours on them. I thought that worked quite well. And then I did this Harlequin play. Eventually I collected my pocket money and got various plays. I don't remember it being too expensive, but I did have to wait, a couple of months before I'd got enough money to pay for these various different plays that I got. But one was High Toby by an English playwright called J.B. Priestley. A lot of these plays were taken from the old Victorian sort of plays that were written, 18th century, 19th century, that sort of thing. And so they were quite sort of grand. There was one called The Crystal Palace, which had lovely sort of scenery in it, but completely, I could never quite understand what the whole story was all about, but I somehow made up my own versions of it. And I invited kids then into my bedroom then, and I had a sort of, clear, there was enough room for about 5 kids to come and sit in. And I remember that my first venture, or serious venture, I thought, of showing the kids was there was a film made in 1947 of Hamlet that Laurence Olivier and various other famous actors were in, and Pollock's produced again a little model theatre sheet. These sheets of the scenery, and the figures were little cutouts of the famous actors. And so I did a few scenes from Hamlet, can you believe? And I remember setting all this up, and I was loving it. I did the first scene in the Horatius walking on the ramparts, and the ghost appeared, and all the rest of it, and that was on a piece of cotton. I lowered him down, and I thought, gosh, the kids are really good. They're really quiet watching this piece of amazing theatre that I was producing. Anyway, I thought, well, I'd hidden myself so I couldn't see the audience, because I thought they should only just look at the proscenium arch. Anyway, I came round the back, and the kids had crept out really quietly because they were bored out of their minds. And that was my first venture into performing to an audience. And I always remember thinking, well, that's my first lesson. Don't just play for yourself. The audience are terribly important, and you're playing to an audience, and they must enjoy it as well. So that was I remember that very clearly. But I can carry on. But I then went and discovered that there was actually I was going to the Pollock's Theatre to get another play, and when I say Pollock's Theatre, the Pollock's shop, and this was a shop in Monmouth Street in very not far from in the West End anyway. It's sort of Leicester Square area. Anyway, I went in there, and they had in those days they had an exhibition of model theatres and old model theatre memorabilia, and it was really fascinating to see. But down the bottom of the shop, at the bottom, there was an old chap setting up some old Victorian marionettes. And I thought, this is fascinating. They were trick ones. In the Victorian times, there was a lot of marionette companies in that sort of period, and they would do sort of famous Victorian musical artists. They would do sort of circus characters. I mean, there was Grimaldi and all these various people that clowns that they depicted. Anyway, they had these. I remember these amazing figures being set up, and I chatted to the chap. I was fairly sort of outgoing and chatty sort of person, and I said, what are these for? And he said, well, we're setting up an exhibition, and it's for the British Puppet and Model Theatre Guild. Well, I never heard of it, sort of thing. So I said, oh, what does that do? Oh, well, we have a lot of amateur people going along, and also professional puppeteers who come along. And I thought, professional puppeteers, there's such a thing? My goodness, how amazing! Anyway, he said, well, you must come along to the guild, and I think he gave me a leaflet. And I seem to remember that it wasn't very far from where I was living. I was living in South London, and it was in Vauxhall, in a funny old church hall called St. Gabriel's Hall. And so I went along there, aged about sort of 13, 14, that sort of thing. And I obviously asked my parents, because I was still at school and stuff, and they said, oh, yes, well, that'll be all right. I think it started at 7 in the evening, and it went on till about 9, and then I could get home, and it wasn't too bad to school the next morning, but one day a week, that would be fine. Anyway, I got there, and I met a lot of very interesting, in fact, they turned out to be quite well-known British puppeteers, and the chairman of the organisation of the guild was a man called Percy Press. He was very famous for his Punch and Judy shows. He was known as the uncrowned king of punch at that time, and there was lots of other puppeteers. Funny enough, Jan Bustle and Anne Hogarth, although Jan was there most of the time, Jan turned up, who formed the Hogarth Puppets, who I talked about with Muffin and Muffin the Mule. So he came in, and that's when first time I saw him. I mean, these were all. I must admit, I was quite surprised. They're all quite. I mean, I say old, but they were all in their sort of 40s, maybe 50s, most of them. But they were fascinating characters, and of course they did marionettes for a living, and this was fantastic. And there was the original, one of the original founders, a man called Harry Wanslaw. And he basically had written a wonderful book in the 1925 when the guild was started called Everybody's Theatre, and it had model theatre and it had marionettes and stuff. And he was still alive. He was, I think probably well into his 80s by then. And he did performances. So I was incredibly lucky to still see some of these old professional puppeteers still performing, still ready, and willing to share their work to up and coming puppeteers, which was fantastic. Anyway, that was an amazing thing. And then I'm running on a little bit, by about 1963, that sort of time, or around maybe a bit before then. I'm very bad on the years. I can never remember nowadays. But anyway, there was. I went to one of the guild meetings, and they were saying, well, actually, there is going to be a meeting of the World Puppetry Organization called Unimar, and I'd sort of heard vaguely about this, but I didn't really take too much notice of this. Oh, by the way, it was a membership organization, so I had a junior membership in those days, and I used to get a newsletter, so I got sort of various information, and there was a wonderful magazine called The Puppet Master, which I got as well. Anyway, this getting back to this Unimar meeting, what was happening was that the Unimar was going to set up its own British section, and they were going to meet at a new theatre called the Little Angel Theatre in Islington. And this was a puppet theatre founded by John Wright, who was a famous South African puppeteer, but also did most of his work over in this country. And this was opened in 1961 and in November, and he was letting them. There was going to be a special meeting, and you could get about 80 people in the theatre. Anyway, sadly, I wasn't able to go to this meeting that they had because there wasn't room for me. I think they'd hired a sort of coach, because there was a lot of European puppeteers had come over, the Secretary General and various people from Prague and Poland and all the Eastern European countries. I mean, it was an amazing sort of event. And so I sadly wasn't able to go to that. But in the meantime, I'd written to various I didn't write to Jerry Anderson, but I did write to a man called what was his name? Gordon Murray, and he'd done some puppet stuff. They had a thing on for BBC called the BBC Puppet Theatre, and he ran that. He was famous latterly for stop motion films called Camberwick Green and Trumpets, and these were little short children's coloured little films that were very popular, again, latterly, sort of late 60s, 70s and 80s, that sort of time. Anyway, before then, he had a sort of marionettes show called Robovia, I remember, a funny sort of medieval characters in a king and queen and a character called, I can't remember his name was, but it was a sort of character, it was like an inventor character, and there was a dragon and all sorts of things. Anyway, I wrote to him, and he wrote back to me eventually. I was still at school thinking about what I was going to do for my career, and said, well, I'm afraid I think it might be better if you go to art school. We don't have room for trainees here at the Puppet Theatre. We have enough puppeteers or something. Terribly disappointed. I thought, what a shame. I'd love to have done that. But I did also write to Bob Pelham, who, I'd told you earlier that I'd had a few of his puppets I'd bought. But he was charming, and he wrote back and said, well, do you realise that there is a puppet theatre started not long ago at called the Little Angel Theatre, and John Wright was the director. Why don't you write to him? And I thought, how amazing! That was a coincidence all at the same time that all this was happening. So I went back to the Guild the following meeting after they had their big meeting, and I was, feeling a bit sad. I thought, oh, well, I've got this lovely letter, but one of the people that had come over for the Unimar meeting was a lovely lady called Edith Murray, and she was the Unimar representative for the Australian puppet sort of Unimar group that they'd set up. I'm not sure whether they'd actually set a Unimar group there, but she was very much involved in the early puppetry in Australia. Anyway, she said, oh, don't worry, come, I'm going to go to the theatre. I'm going to see production of The Little Mermaid next weekend. You must come along. Come with me, and I'll introduce you to John. I've known him for several years. And I thought, how wonderful. So I went along, and to make a long story short, we saw this production of The Little Mermaid, which was, to me, the most amazing piece of puppet theatre I'd ever seen up until then. It completely moved me. It was, the Hans Andersen story, not the sort of Disney-type version. This was the original Hans Andersen story where, sadly, the mermaid dies and turns into sort of the foam of the sea in the end and stuff, and it was beautifully performed, most gorgeous marionettes, beautifully carved by John, who is famous for his carving of marionettes. And it was actually performed live in those days. They had the puppeteers actually spoke the words, but apart from the narration, which was performed by a wonderful puppeteer called Barry Smith, who was in fact a voice teacher for the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and taught Laurence Olivier his Othello voice when he was played that many, in the early, sort of late 60s, I think it was then. But anyway, he'd known John Wright, and John had obviously had been in the business for quite a while, so he'd got an amazing group of people to perform and just knew lots of people in the art world. Anyway, I was totally spellbound, and I was introduced to John. John said, oh, this is marvellous, and said, would you like to go backstage and put bags over the puppets? I couldn't believe it. I thought, how wonderful. So here I was putting the bags to protect them from the dust and stuff of the theatre, and it was the theatre then were only seated 80 people. It had an auditorium that the seats were taken from an old Collins music hall, which was just up the road in Islington Green, and the exit lights were taken from there as well, and they were, you couldn't do it now with all the health and safety rules, but the exit lights were lit by night lights that you lit with a match, and you just put the night light in and then put the exit light down, and there it was, that was lit. There was, it was just a most charming and amazing place, and I thought, I've really got to go here. This is the place where I can learn, because being a theatre, I thought, well, they'd have all sorts of different puppets as well, and it'll be, I could be there Monday to Friday and learn as much as I could, and I just thought this would be fantastic. So I did cheekily write to him, but eventually, and ask if I could possibly become a member, or do you have apprenticeships, or is there anything, this sort of thing? And very sweetly he wrote back and said, yes, I do remember your visit with Edith Murray, and yes, look, I do have the old apprenticeship, but usually people will have to pay for a fee or for services rendered to the theatre. Well, we didn't have money as a family to pay for fees for the puppetry, so it would be a case of me just going there and living, from my parents, basically. And I remember going back to my house after the visit, after writing this letter and getting the letter back, and going back in to home and saying, Mum, by that time, by the way, I'd gone in the odd weekends in this. There was a bit of a break between the letter and me actually sort of applying for an apprenticeship, and I'd just go in and volunteer and show people to their seats and that sort of thing, and just get familiar with the company, who were absolutely charming and really lovely. Anyway, I went back and after this letter, once I got the reply, and I said, look, Dad and Mum and I remember they saying, this is what I want to do, and I was now coming up to the age of sort of, a very young age, but sort of 15, and at those days you could leave school at 15. And so this is what happened. I went and spoke to parents, and they sort of said, well, we'll have a little chat. And they went off into the kitchen, probably for about a couple of minutes, to decide what they were going to do with this wayward son who was going to leave his education behind. And, of course, my father being a teacher, it was not probably the easiest decision they could make. I thought it was... They were all out of the room for about it felt like, half an hour. Well, wasn't anything that long. Anyway, they came back, and I could see the sort of twinkle in my mother's eye that perhaps this was okay. And they said, well, we can give you 6 months. Yes, you'll be able to join the theatre. We'll be able to support you for that. But after that, I think really, we'll have to, get really, by that time, hopefully they'll have decided that, maybe this would, be the right job for you, and they'll be able to pay you some form of a wage. Anyway, I was so delighted. I was thrilled, and I started then my professional career at the Little Angel Theatre. So it couldn't have been a nicer, better place to work. And I basically, did all the things as apprentices do. I swept the auditorium after the shows. I showed people to their seats. We did absolutely everything. We picked up the phone and answered the bookings. We didn't have the sort of the computer system in those days. It was just literally a booking book, and we marked them. We had a pencil tied to the booking book, and we ticked off the various people and then took their names and their phone numbers. And we made coffee in the interval we sold chocolate biscuits. We then, once the audience were in, and we shut the curtains of into the auditorium, and we went all backstage. And there was 5 of us in the show. Actually, it was 6 including me, and I was doing the scene changes. For instance, as soon as the curtain came down, I go in and change the scene, and we'd obviously they'd rehearse me in, so I knew what I was doing. And it was just an amazing experience. And I was there. In fact, I stayed with the theatre for 8 months, as it happened. Sadly, my father died when I was 16, and they very sweetly paid me £2 a week. This was way back in 1960. I think 64, that sort of time. It gave me a fantastic grounding in puppetry because, of course, being a building, we did productions where they were mostly marionettes. We also eventually recorded, in those days, John had a wonderful Revox tape recorder, and we recorded the voices for the puppets, and we got people in to do that. But because I was quite young, I would do some of the younger characters, so I ended up doing voices, like there's a little character, one of the first plays they did was Wild Night of the Witches, and I played little Timmy Weem, little boy, and that was wonderful to do that. It's terribly exciting to be able to be part of that. And eventually, of course, I was able to go up on the bridge, which is the bridge that stretches across the stage where you stand up to work the marionettes. The strings were about sort of 6 foot from the ground of the stage, and the puppets were about 26 inches high. So, and as I say, beautifully carved and costumed and painted. I mean, there was a great team of people. I can name a few. You might have heard of them. There was a wonderful puppeteer, sadly died now, but Christopher Leith, who eventually became the artistic director of the Little Angel many years later. And he'd been to art school in Wimbledon, but he'd made his own. He became a wonderful carver and made his own set of puppets and stuff. There was a wonderful lady, an actress called Joyce Wren, and she was always known as Joyce the Voice in the theatre because she did a lot of the voices for the puppets, as well as being an amazing actress. And she taught voice as well, which was lovely. And so I had some lessons with her. I mean, when we first started, I'd never met anybody who had a most marvellous voice like this, very, very sort of RP. She was that sort of person. And I thought, I've never heard anybody like that. So I used to imitate terribly. I was very rude and naughty. I used to imitate her. I remember when I knocked on the door of the theatre when I first, and she opened the door. Hello, can we help you? And I said, oh, hello, I'm Ronnie Ledoux. I'm here to see John Wright. But I put on this posh voice, sort of mimicking her without realizing it, really bad, really. And said, oh, yes, I'm here to see John Wright. Well, and she looked at me, who is this rather ghastly boy? Anyway, she said, John, there's a boy outside here to see you. And I could hear John's voice in the background. He said, well, has he got his mother with him? And she, no, oh, good, I don't have to change my trousers. I mean, he is generally the artist, so he didn't have to bother with that. And I always remember that. That was quite fun. But, no, we became great friends in the end, and she was amazing. There was another puppeteer, well, Lindy Wright. She was at that stage. She was Lindy Parker, who had seen John Wright's shows when she was about 11 and came over. She got a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Art, and so she was a wonderful painter and artist, and she eventually became John Wright's wife, and she had designs the most wonderful sets and puppets, and obviously made the most beautiful puppets as well. And and myself and other, there was other people too, but it was so marvelous. I can't explain it really. I mean, it's so sad in a way that there aren't sort of apprenticeships now like that, where you could go as a sort of young school lad, or girl, and then just learn the puppetry in that way. Nowadays, luckily there are schools. And coming right up to date, there's a wonderful school called the Curious School of Puppetry, which Sarah Wright, which is John Wright's daughter, has set up in the last 4 years. I'm a tutor on it too, and it's a marvelous school. And it's mostly, it's not so much an academic training, it's more practical. You learn a little bit of life drawing, you learn a bit of movement, but you also work every type of puppet that you can. And she gets the most wonderful tutors not apart from myself, to teach the students. And it's usually a sort of 10-week course, and they produce performances at the end of it, and that's really fabulous. I mean, I love that. And again, over the years, I started a school with my then partner Caroline Astelbert, who's written several books on puppetry in education, and she's now a doctor of she's got her PhD, and that's all rather exciting. But we set up the London School of Puppetry. There's various schools now which are, I mean, they're one. It is wonderful that we've got these courses available for people. And of course, the Little Angel Theatre does courses as well. So that's good, and I teach on those. But it was, I don't know, there was something very special about having an apprenticeship. But that's really all I can say.
I think a lot of times beginning puppeteers, they want to start straight off puppeteering the lead character. They want to be the star of the show. But what value is there in starting off by maintaining the props and the puppets and making set changes during the show and things like that, actually doing the apprenticeship?
Yeah, well, the biggest value really is, I think, is that you're watching these amazing people perform. You're learning from watching. There's nothing better than that. And you learn everything then. You see, that's why the lighting is set like that. That's why those puppets move forward and one moves slightly back so it doesn't mask the light off the lead puppet or whatever. All those sort of things you learn. And you're absorbing it. Sometimes you're absorbing it without actually suddenly realizing you are, if you see the point. And the other thing too was I may not have been operating the puppets, straight away. Obviously, I had to learn how to work the puppets, and that, you see, I would do in the lunch hours or in the breaks in between the shows. I'd go up on the bridge. Christopher Leith would teach me. Lindy would give me some lessons. John, when he had the time, I mean, he was sort of administrator, everything. I mean, he was fairly busy, but I mean, he did eventually give me some training too, but it was more the company. But I mean, that was wonderful. And then gradually I was able to work a puppet, just walking a puppet on in one scene and then walking it off or whatever. So to have that sort of thing, I never had this thing that I mean, of course I wanted to work the puppet straight away, but I mean, I knew from watching that these people were doing amazing things with these figures, and it's something that I wouldn't be able to do straight away. And I remember when I first picked up the puppet in my hand, I thought, oh, they're miles away down there. They look tiny from from standing up on the bridge and working a puppet. So it took a while, as I say, to learn. But then I had that time, and I wasn't, I didn't feel that it was time lost, as it were, because I was able, as you say, I went into the workshop. I saw how they were carved. I wasn't really a maker of puppets, and I never really am. I wanted to perform. I wanted to learn about the lighting, and in fact, in the end, my first big job was apart from doing the odd puppet on, was to work the lighting board. That was, the major sort of thing. And it was wonderful to learn about that. And then I eventually helped John with the sound, for mixing music. We in those days it was all tape recorders, but I found that really fascinating. So you sort of find a slot that you really enjoy doing. And John was an amazing trainer, really. I mean, he would think, well, he's not going to be much good at carving, although he did give me a chisel for my wedding present. I remember thinking, come on, you've got to carve, learn to do some. And I did actually. We have these middle sections of the puppet. We call them, they look like biscuits, plain biscuits, and they were the sections in between the sort of the hip joint and the chest joint, and they just sort of stop the puppet from, they bend over much nicely when you have these little biscuits in all them. And that's what I carved. I also carved a chest puppet, and I think the puppet isn't in use at the moment, but it is there, stored away somewhere. But so that was quite nice. I never really got round to carving heads and hands. I mean, that's an art in itself. But I mean, by that time I was operating most of the, I'm showing off, but the sort of lead characters in the shows by that time. So I was very happy in what I was doing. I thought that was my sort of forte, was to be a performer, and that's what I ended up. Well, I'm still doing so.
Well, and after working at the theater, I've heard you say that you traveled to Czechoslovakia for a puppet festival.
That's right.
What sort of puppetry did you see at that festival?
Oh, wonderful. That was, fun enough, it was an amateur festival in Karlovy Vary in at the end of 1964, 65, that sort of time. I'm very bad on dates, I do apologize. But I went along with my two mentors of glove puppetry, because being at the theatre, people would come, other puppeteers would come obviously and see shows, and I got to know this lovely lady called Violet Philpott. And she had worked with... as a photo retoucher before she got involved in puppets, but she went along to another organisation, which I then went along to as well, called the Educational Puppetry Association, and that was a sort of offshoot of the Puppet Guild originally. I think started in the 40s, but it was mainly for teachers who wanted to use puppetry in education. And the wonderful, wonderful inspirational teacher, and in a way my sort of mentor for glove puppets, is a man called A.R. Philpott, and he was known in the business as Panto Puck, and he wrote several books on puppetry, and he was also editor of the Puppet Post, the sort of magazine of the Educational Puppetry Association. And he was an amazing man. I learned a lot from Violet and Panto at the EPA. They taught me, they in fact said, look, Ron, you're actually quite good at improvising, because you made up all these plays while you were playing with our puppets. You've got to make your own play and do a one-man show. And over the years, Violet helped me make a dodo puppet, and I had this character called Snitchity Titch, which, in fact, I first did in Carlo Vivari. I must get back to Prague, mustn't I? Sorry. And that was a play called The King Who Lost His Crown, and that was Violet's play that she'd written, and originally, in fact, was performed at the Little Angel with her and Christopher Heath, a two-man show, but we made it into a sort of, I think it was 5 of us that performed, and it was quite hilarious, actually. We played in this wonderful theatre in Carlo Vivari, a beautiful old theatre, and we were the smallest company that performed. I mean, I was just amazed. There were companies from Prague, for instance, the wonderful Hovnik and Spabel Theatre came and did a performance, their touring show, and there was like, I suppose, 25 puppeteers doing an amazing puppetry. What I call the first time I'd ever seen sort of black theatre, the theatre where the puppeteers were all dressed in black, and they had the beams of light from the side, and you put your puppet into the beam of light, and the puppeteer totally disappeared. But it was just amazing work. They also had sort of marionettes where people were dressed in black could sort of move them, give them extra movement if necessary. They were quite large, I remember. And then, of course, to see the old Hovnik and Spabel characters, which were famous in Prague, which were amazing to see, although I didn't understand a word they were saying, but their operating was absolutely beautiful. And there was other companies from, sadly, I can't remember, I think there was France, there was mostly Eastern Europe, but there was German companies, Polish companies, and it was, as I say, it was the first time that my eyes were agog, watching all this stuff. And I was being the youngest puppeteer, too. I was given a puppet by Jan Malik, who was then the Secretary General of Unimar. And because I was this young puppeteer, I think mostly it was just unusual for Eastern European countries in those days to see so few people working a show. And when we came out, sadly, one of the puppeteers, Glyn Edwards, who's a really well-known Punch and Judy man now, but and was quite well-known then. But anyway, he came out. He'd sadly injured his ankle, so he'd had a plaster. In those days, you put sort of plaster right up to his calf, so he limped out. He still did the show. I came out as this young thing. There was Violet, a little bit older than. Then John Blundell, fun enough, was in the show as well, and another puppeteer. And we came out, and we looked a complete sort of amazing group of people of different ages working this show, which they absolutely loved. We did learn a little bit of Czech. I had a couple of lines or something. I don't think I can pronounce it properly now, but it's something like or something like that. That means come and let us take the waters, because Carlo Vivari was famous for this amazing sort of springs that gave you amazing sort of it was a bit like they gave you sort of they had healthy minerals in the water, and in fact I think Carlo Vivari was famous for that right from the way back. I think the English people used to come and visit it and stay sort of from the Victorian times, I seem to remember. But anyway, it was an amazing time, and that was a wonderful influence. And I think coming back from that, in fact, John Wright and Lindy turned up to see it. In fact, they gave me some money for my fares to go there. That's when I just finished my first stint at the Little Angel, and so that was really lovely. But I did go back to work at the Little Angel Theatre, so more or less full time. And one of the productions we did was The Soldier's Tale, which is Stravinsky's music, and we produced black theatre puppets for the Queen Elizabeth Hall. I'm running ahead a little bit, but this was the late 60s, and that was an amazing production for us. And that was, I think, that sort of influence of puppetry that we'd seen in Prague was an influence, obviously, to John and Lindy. Lindy certainly had made these sets. She got a whole group of puppeteers. It was rather a last-minute job. I think she created all the figures for it, and we had quite large figures. Some were over 6 foot tall. We had slightly smaller ones to give you the scale of the different scenes and things. But and we had sort of stepped stage so that we can walk back, and they gave again a feeling of scale and distance and all the rest. We had an amazing cart where the devil was taking this soldier who and was sort of flying through the clouds or whatever it's to another country, and we had these horses, I mean almost life size, pulling the cart, and the soldier was all agog while this was all happening. But it was an amazing piece, and we had Daniel Barenboim conducting the English Chamber Orchestra. Oh, we were very, very lucky, and that was a big show, which I think sort of people talk about Warhorse being a sort of change of puppetry scene. It sort of brought English puppetry to life in I suppose in the sense that English drama critics suddenly came to see stuff. Well, they certainly did in that time, in the late 60s. And the Elizabeth Hall, we had the music critics came and gave wonderful reviews. I've got a scrapbook full of reviews from various papers. And at that time, at the Little Angel, there was very little press coverage. I think, again, puppetry was something that, was for children. It wasn't really anything terribly special. I mean, we would see puppetry on television. That was all great. And again, it was mostly for kids. And so suddenly doing something like The Soldier's Tale, which was obviously for adults, it was a big revelation. Well, sort of almost... people just totally were amazed. I just hadn't seen anything, or the general theatre public. And so as I said, we got these amazing reviews from all these papers. And I think that sort of began to put puppetry on, in this country anyway, a bit on the map in terms of general theatre and the general theatre-going public. They thought, maybe there is something, a bit more interesting with puppets. Well, it can be done for adults as well. Of course, in Europe and Eastern European countries, of course, puppetry is part of the theatre scene. I mean, for instance, certainly in Eastern Europe, I mean, if you go to Moscow or something, you had the Bolshoi Ballet, you had the circus, you had the puppet theatre, and they had performances for adults. Abratsov being the famous puppeteer that set up the Abratsov Theatre Company in Moscow, and people would come. Everybody would go to the theatre. I mean, the thing was the children would go straight from school and go and see it. They'd see circus, they'd see ballet, they'd see theatre, they'd saw opera, they'd see the lot. And so it was really marvelous. So in a way, in those countries, as I say, in Eastern Europe, the puppetry was established for everybody, and in a way, Europe had had puppet theatre as well. That was sort of most, but again, I think it was sort of more family orientated. It was Eastern Europe that sort of opened up or kept the tradition of puppetry alive in a sense. We had over here, we had a lot of different companies doing. Always, and funny enough, they always wanted to do shows for adults, but ended up that it wasn't. It just somehow it didn't. They didn't make it. People just said no, it's got to be family shows, and most people would think of as puppets as just Punch and Judy and stuff like that. But again, as I say, as the years went by, the Little Angel created an audience, and that John never ever played down to children. The shows that he produced, he always used to say, it's the adults that pay to come to see these shows. They've got to be entertained as well as the children. The children will get a lot out of it. And we also did shows for what we called young children, the sort of the younger audience. We used to do sort of Saturday morning shows. In fact, I talked earlier about my glove puppet show. Well, I ended up doing my little one-man glove puppet show. I ended up producing a show with Snitch and Dodo. One of the characters I said I used in Carlo Vivari, and the Dodo was another character. I had Robber in it. Just these three characters, and I did this one-man show for years. I still use the characters, although I don't do so much that show anymore. But I did, Saturday morning shows, as did Violet, who was a wonderful one-lady performer with her wonderful characters, the Bandicoot and Miss Polly, and there was a lovely play called The Egg, and she performed in several Unimar festivals with that as well. And she was a brilliant puppeteer on her own right. But no, I think the influence certainly of Eastern Europe and that Prague visit was very, very exciting, and it certainly influenced a lot of people. I mean, we chatted, amongst puppeteers and said, we've got to really change this, the audience's perception of puppetry. Now we've seen this, we can do shows, using marionettes, film, shadows, gloves, all in one, in one production. And we certainly did do that.
After the festival, you got a chance to work with Hogarth Puppets. Can you tell us a bit about what you did with them?
Oh, yes, I can. It was lovely. That was wonderful. Yes, straight after the festival, I had a phone call from Jan Bussell, who I'd obviously met briefly at the Puppet Guild, and saying, look, we have a summer tour we do of the London parks, and it's a caravan show, and we need stage managers to help us, and there'd be the odd bit of puppetry as well. And I thought, how wonderful. And I remember he offered me the grand sum. Now, I'd been earning about £2 a week at the Little Angel, and the grand sum of £10. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And anyway, I went along and went to Egham, where he lived, which is sort of in Surrey, nearby by the River Thames. It was absolutely beautiful, and it's very interesting. Both Jan and John Wright were very different, obviously different personalities, but they were around at the same sort of time. And Jan, in a way, was more wasn't so much. I'm going to say he got other puppeteers to make puppets. He made puppets, but I think he knew that his designs of puppets weren't the best, but he got wonderful designers to help him make stuff. So some of his puppets were absolutely amazing and wonderful, but he was very theatrical, and he'd worked, as I say, on the BBC. He was a television producer, as well as running the Hogarth Puppets at one time, but in the early days of television. So he had a great background of theatre, and Anne Hogarth, his wife, she was a stage manager. She trained at RADA or somewhere like that, and in stage management, but also was had a training, had a theatre background. So they came to puppetry with a different sort of approach, but they also felt that the adults were needed to be catered for too, and but of course once they produced the Muffin character, they were a little bit stymied for doing more adult work, because this became the first television TV puppet icon, if you like. It started in 1946 and went on till 1955, when Annette Mills sadly died. But anyway, getting back to my working with the Hogarths, it was absolutely delightful. A very different experience. Where I worked with a young puppeteer who's absolutely brilliant shadow puppeteer, Richard Bradshaw. He came from Australia. He came over from Australia to visit England and then stayed on to do this season. So we were the two helpers in the show, and that was a wonderful experience. I'd met actually Richard in Carlo Vivari. He'd come with Edith Murray to Carlo Vivari as well. So it was lovely that Edith was there too, and so I'd met him and knew him, and we learned. I learned a whole different way of performing, I suppose. They were short string puppets. I discovered Muffin the Mule again, and watching Anne working the puppet was amazing. Jan, of course, fronted it. He sat on the front of the edge of the caravan and sang the song. There's a sort of famous, here comes Muffin, Muffin the Mule, dear old Muffin, playing the fool. Here comes Muffin, everybody sing. Here comes Muffin the Mule, that sort of thing. And on came this Muffin, and he had some carrots stuck to in his mouth, and there was, as I say, all these wonderful characters like Oswald and Hubert the hippopotamus, and as I say, Oswald the ostrich. All these different characters came on, and they were sort of repeating some of the old stuff they did with Annette Mills. But it still went. Kids still loved this sort of two-way thing with a presenter out front and the puppet doing silly dances and tricks and things. And we also did what we call puppet ballets, as Jan would call it. And we had a toy shop ballet, which we did originally. And I've got still in my scrapbooks, I've got these sort of notes that I wrote down. Push on set here, worker, toy soldier here, because I was up and down off the bridge. It was, as I say, strings weren't all that long strings. Obviously, we were in a sort of caravan with a proscenium cut in the side of it, but it was a great experience, and they were both lovely, really kind to me, and booked me again the following year to do the next summer season. So, and in fact, I did a bit more the following year. I mean, I did the I think it was something like from July to early September. It's quite a long period, and we had 3 shows a day. So it was quite, we had 3 different parks. We did all the London parks, so I got to know all these London parks, and some audiences were very interesting. We played the sort of rougher areas, and it's not rough now, of course, but in those days, a little bit rough Hackney parks, I remember. And this is a funny story that I quote in my book, which I'll talk about later, I'm sure. But whereas Jan was singing, Here Comes Muffin, and suddenly there was this thump noise I heard this against the caravan, sort of wall of the caravan, and he leant back to Anne and said, "Anne, they're throwing eggs at us." And I pulled the curtain down. It was a sort of roller curtain, and Jan came round into back into the caravan, and we huddled together while the park keeper somehow managed to get hold of this kid, I suppose, or something, and we sort of cancelled the rest of the show, as far as I remember. And to this day, I don't know about to this day, but I have a photograph of me standing outside the caravan, and there's a sort of stain you can see, and we could never get it off of this egg. But I mean, that was a silly event that happened, but most of the time, we did had shows that were really exciting, great fun, and audiences all turned out to see. And you might start off with, say, 20 kids, and by the time you finish your show, there was about 300 kids. Where they all came from, goodness knows, but they were there watching the performance, which was wonderful. And it was mostly children, but there was obviously families and all sorts of different people. We also played the Royal Parks, that's Kensington Gardens and Greenwich, and all these rather grander parks as well. That was all part of the deal. Yes, no, they were lovely. I mean, just going on a little bit in my time with puppetry, I still actually work Muffin now. I mean, what happened was, just running ahead, I worked with the Hogarths, and then sadly, eventually, Jan died, and then Anne died, and I got to know them. They became great friends, really, and their daughter took over Muffin. Muffin had been off television, but she lived in a place called Budley Salterton in Devon, and she brought, she obviously had 2 children she brought up. They weren't so keen on the puppets then, but Sally carried on doing a little bit, and she played sort of women's institutes and old people's homes, because by that time Muffin was very well known to a certain age group, and that was the sort of age group. We're talking about sort of 70s and 80s, 90s really, that sort of time. But sadly, she passed away. She had a brain tumor and died only age 60, and I was rung up by her husband and to say, Ronnie, they'd made an animated version of Muffin. She was involved in that before she died, but it was obviously, this is a long process, and sadly she'd passed away. But it was for the BBC, so I was asked to work Muffin, as they'd known me as a puppeteer. I'd already been quite established by then, and so I went along to the old BBC television centre and did sort of publicity for that for them, and eventually ended up doing a pantomime we had a larger Muffin made for the Theatre Royal Windsor, which was great fun. So I'm still friendly with the family. That's Lucinda, the granddaughter, and William, the grandson. And in fact, I believe it or not, I don't have him in my hands at the moment, but I have Muffin with me in my house here. I borrow. There's I shouldn't be saying this, but there are two versions of Muffin, or two puppets. They're identical, basically. And Lucinda has one, and William has one. And in fact, he has several of the larger ones as well. But that's I'm really referring to one that Lucinda has. And she doesn't live so far away from me. She lives out in the country, but it's a sort of shorter train journey away than rather from Devon, where William lives. But anyway, Lucinda's lends me the Muffin character, the original Muffin, and so I take him along. I do, fun enough, like Sally does, I do shows anywhere and everywhere, but where he's really popular is sort of old people's homes, and I go in and I do a sort of talk about my life with puppetry and show puppets as part of that, and Muffin comes out at the end, and of course they all, oh my goodness, they all remember that, and we all sing the song, and that's really lovely. So he continues on, which is rather nice, really, and I'm very lucky to have had that time working with the Bustles, and also in continuing doing it, really. They're certainly the Muffin character, and it's rather nice. I've been able to have worked many of the sort of television iconic puppets of in British television anyway.
Well, now, of course, speaking of iconic characters, you still do perform. You did perform and still do perform as Zippy from the program Rainbow.
That's right. Yes, indeed. Well, that happened I think I started working with Zippy in about 1973, that sort of time. And basically what happened was, the story is that they turned up probably about 1971, that sort of time. That was an original producer and a researcher to the Little Angel. And I was having some puppets made for me for one of the Saturday morning shows for younger kids. And I called them the Hubble Bubbles. And one of them was I can only describe it like a brown potato, but he had a zip across his mouth. Now, I always think this, I don't know whether it was true, but the researcher came in and was chatting to John Wright, and John Wright wasn't all that keen, to be honest, on children's television particularly. He wanted to do a bit, more sophisticated stuff. Anyway, she came and she said, I'd like you to make, some puppets, and, it'd be very nice. We've got this program we're going to do for preschool children. I'm sure it'd be very interesting for you to do. Anyway, John, I think, really wasn't interested at all, but the researcher was wandering around the workshop, and I always say that she saw this puppet with a zip across its mouth and thought, that's quite interesting. Anyway, they went away, and I never heard anything about it at all. But then my friend Violet, who I've mentioned, Violet Philpott, phoned me and said, Ronnie, I've been asked to do a television series, and it's called Rainbow. It's basically the reason why these independent television companies started to do their preschool programs was that, of course, we'd had Sesame Street over here, I think, I don't know when it started over here, maybe 1970 or something like that. But there was a lot of criticism, sadly, not of the puppetry or the presentations of the show, but of the spellings and the way that English was taught. Theatre was spelt in a different way, and various pronunciations were different, obviously. So, and the educationists of our beautiful country over here said, oh no, this is wrong, we're teaching too much Americanism, sorry about this, and so they decided that the independent company should make their own preschool programs, but of course, sadly, without the budget that Sesame Street had or the size of studio, and Rainbow was one of the first ones to be produced. And Violet was one of the puppeteers who made the original Zippy puppet with the zip. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, how interesting, But I thought, well, I didn't, I just like to think, well, it's very weird that iconically years later I ended up working this puppet and still do now. But anyway, she did the original series, and then they changed it for a bit, and then Violet, sadly, actually, when I say they changed it, Violet had, in those days, with television puppets, we didn't stand like the Muppets do, and you're not all that comfortable standing doing stuff in the television studio, but at least you had to sort of sit under a table, and you were in a terrible positions, really, because they just didn't know, and we didn't really know about sort of puppetry. We as far as sense of we'd have to do it because we're suddenly earning what we thought huge amounts of money suddenly with the television fees, and we didn't want to miss that because we could use that to spend on our own productions while we weren't in the studio, that sort of thing. So that was the thing. So sadly, Violet thought that, I'm sure, like many of us did when we first started in the television world. And so we agreed. We did everything. They said, "Oh, that's all right. We'll cope with that." And of course, poor thing, she did something to her back. I think one of the discs went or something. So she was unable to continue with the series. She was doing a voice of one of the characters. So I remember she was literally lying flat out, and the famous voice artist, fun enough, did lots of early voices. A man called his name slipped from me. What's his name? His name is, I can see a picture of him. Sorry, it's gone out of my head. I might be able to remember it a bit later. But he came along and recorded with Violet, poor thing, lying on the floor. They had a sort of mini tape recorder to get so they could carry on with the series that she was, because it was mid-series, obviously, this happened. But anyway, make a long story short, another puppeteer took over doing Zippy character. We didn't voice Zippy. The original chap did the voices of Zippy, and then they got another voice man in who was very well known for Zippy and George voices, which was a man called Roy Skelton, and he took over, and John Thurtle, the puppeteer, who took over the Zippy puppet operating. And while he came along, he was also a very good puppet maker and performer, and he took over the making of the Zippy puppets, and they introduced George, this lovely pink hippo, who was the sort of foil to Zippy. Zippy's character is very sort of know-all. He knows everything, and is like the naughty schoolboy that everybody has inside them that doesn't always let out. And of course, I think that's part of his fame. Really, people really loved him because I think people just love naughty characters anyway. They're much more interesting than rather the sort of heroine, the decent sort of puppet's really boring, for a kid. So, but they loved it, this show-off. He said, and it always used to sort of be rude to everybody, really. Not rude necessarily. He just sort of knew, as I say, he was a know-all, and he was a bit naughty. But anyway, people still love him today, and I took over because John Thurtle had started doing his own puppet productions for television, or he'd got a series on the BBC called Playboard with his partner Ian Allen, that both of them produced this show. And so he just couldn't carry on with the performances, and rang me up, and he was a friend who I'd known in fact, from his early days, really, of starting with puppets. In fact, we met I was on tour with John Wright's theatre company, and he came along, and we had a person working with us who wasn't brilliant, but we were playing in Nuffield Theatre in Southampton, and he was a student, believe it or not, studying economics, and he had a break, and he was hanging around the backstage area, and he said, "Can I do anything to help?" And I said, "Oh yes, please, you can help us set up this stage," which he did do, and it was like a breath of fresh air having him around. He was really good, and eventually he joined the Little Angel Theatre, and then left the theatre and set up his own company. Anyway, he carried on, getting back to his television work, he carried on doing that and asked me if I would take over, and I literally went off for a luncheon date meeting the producer, who of course had remembered from the early days of visiting the theatre, and very funny. I mean, I hadn't really auditioned much until that. I mean, it wasn't really an audition, it was a lunch chat, met the rest of the company, met the presenter, and the other puppeteer, who, funny enough, I'd known as well, because she had started at the Little Angel Theatre, and we'd gone out a few times together, bless her. So that was quite nice. So we were sort of friends, so it was really nice. And anyway, I remember, I think, I don't know whether I got the job through chatting to Pamela, the producer, but she sort of said, "So what sort of puppets have you done?" I said, "Oh, I've done a lot of work at the Little Angel Theatre." She said, "Oh, yes." Well, of course, her experience at the Little Angel Theatre wasn't all that good, so she wasn't terribly impressed with that. But then I mentioned Jan Buffalo and Anne Hogarth, and I said, of course, I worked in, they, of course, were famous for Muffin the Mule. And she went, oh, Muffin, yes, no, I do remember. And I think, she said, "So when can you start? Can you come in tomorrow and have a look at the few of the..." And I thought, oh, my goodness. And so I had a 6-week contract almost straight away. and I carried on all the way through. I carried on Rainbow from 1973, I think it was, till 1995, although the Thames company that had lost its franchise in 1992, but the head of the controller of children's television brought the brand, as it were, the Rainbow brand and the characters, and produced his own version of Rainbow. And I was asked if I would, I actually auditioned for it, but I ended up then by that time doing the voice of Zippy, and I used to do it when Roy couldn't go to various events. It became very popular. I didn't realise how popular until, fun enough, the series finished on Thames Television, because somehow when you're not a face on television, you're not noticed, which in a way I quite like. I can walk around and nobody says, "Oh, that's the man who does Zippy." I mean, it isn't, it didn't matter to me. I was very happy just to be, in working this puppet. But with the change of when the franchise finished, we did sort of, apart from me doing these other programs, other Rainbow programs, I would do. This is where I am babbling. I'm going to go back to start again. When Roy couldn't perform with the. When I say couldn't go out when we did these sort of opening fates and various sort of publicity things, I would go along, obviously, with the puppets or with another puppeteer, and I would then do Martha should offer Zippy, hello, and somehow, because I'd heard it for so long, I sort of somehow managed to sound like Roy, which was great. And so I do the Zippy voice and do the puppet, and that was great. I must admit, I always found it very strange that when I first went into the studio, that they had an actor that had to do the voice of the puppet. It seemed very strange because, obviously through the years before that, I'd always voiced characters that I'd done, even though we may have pre-recorded some stuff. We still did the voices. So I did find that strange. But again, I think, the television companies in those days thought that, puppeteers don't speak. They're not actors. They haven't had training, which was, of course, very untrue. I mean, I did have training eventually, but I didn't, not at the beginning as far as the voice was concerned, but several people like Joyce Wren and Barry Smith, who was a very well-known voice coach, gave me lessons as well. So I did have some, but anyway, that was a wonderful time, in a sense that Rainbow, changed my life in a sense. I still carried on working at the Little Angel Theatre. I would do this is before I was married. I had I literally did 5 days a week. The Rainbow sort of time of what we did was we'd rehearse or have a read through. We recorded 3 programs a week, and we were in a tiny studio, Studio 3 in Teddington Studios, which sadly is no longer. They've knocked it down and made luxury flats, but that's another story. And we'd rehearse in the Yacht Club. Now, that sounds terribly grand. It wasn't terribly grand, I must admit. It was a bit slightly larger than a bicycle shed, but we were upstairs. It was sort of, anyway, we were in there, and we'd read through the 3 scripts that we had that were going to be filmed the following week, and we'd time everything so it would all be timed, so that I think the programs in those days were sort of 20 minutes or 21 minutes or something like that, and so we had to made sure that everything was, the scripts were long enough and they were right up to the time of the allotted time, and then the producer and the PA would go away, leaving us with the director, and we'd sort of walk through the moves with the puppets. We did have monitors to see, but not for rehearsals. We just sat at the table holding the puppets up so we could see. So in a way, the rehearsals were more for the actors, the Geoffrey, the presenter, and Bungle, the actor who was in the skin of Bungle the bear. They were the it was in a way rehearsals for them. We could see what they were doing, and we obviously got familiar with the script. And Roy was there reading he used to produce the George voice. "Oh, hello, I'm George. He spoke like that. Oh, yes." And he would just, go in between. So, "Oh, hello, George. Oh, hello, I'm George. Yeah, I know you're George. Look, be quiet. I'm talking. Oh, yeah, sorry, Zippy." So, he'd be doing all this sort of stuff. And we ended up, rehearsing in that way. And we'd as we got to know each other, it was a bit like almost like school terms. We knew each other so well that we could add in little bits of movement and maybe change the script a little bit, to make it funny, or if we thought of something funny to do. And usually the directors were quite happy with that. And then we went through the 3 programs, and then the weekend we went away to learn the lines. Well, luckily, you see, I didn't really have to learn the lines because Roy was, speaking them for us as long as we listened and did lip sync to the characters. That was the main thing. So, and fun enough, when you did puppetry in that way, you ended up by getting, not in a way the words, it sounds a bit funny, but the words did matter, but they didn't, in the sense that you got to know the rhythm of the speech of each character. So Zippy spoke very quite fast, so you got into the rhythm, and I could hear Roy's voice, and I sort of know, even when he took a breath to speak, I knew that he was, that's when he was going, and I knew how he would speak that sort of zippy line. I got to know all the sort of various characteristics of the character through listening to Roy over the years, and so it was really, it's quite interesting. But then we'd have a Monday afternoon. We'd come in and do another rehearsal, and then we'd come in on Tuesday. And Tuesday would be what we call the producer's run, and the producer and the PA would come in and time the 3 programs and make sure that it looked right. For instance, where there was a great thing that we weren't allowed to use knives, not that we were going to use knives, but kitchen knives to do anything with, because that was too sharp, it would hurt the children. And we had to use round nose scissors. We couldn't have any scissors with any points on the end of them. And so and everything had to be very safe and all the rest of it, because we had an educational advisor that made sure that the scripts were educationally correct and all the rest of it. And then on the Tuesday, that was the final day. Everything then was timed and everything, and that they were either they were happy or they weren't. But they would say, "Well, we'll have to cut this because you've extended that script a little bit. So please, can you we're going to have to cut those lines." And so that was that. Or you need to extend it a little bit. It's a bit short, that one. But usually it was the other way around. We'd extended it ourselves, so it was cutting, which isn't quite so bad. And then Wednesday we'd get there. I'd get there for, I think we were in the studio starting, I think, something like 8:30 in the morning. I'd have breakfast in the canteen first. I'd get there quite early. It was quite a distance for me to travel, but anyway, got there early, and we'd record 2 programs on Wednesday in this rather small studio. It was amazing what we did in the space. And then on Thursday we'd record the 3rd program, and if there was anything that needed retaking, if there was any time left over on that Thursday, we'd do some retakes or something, and they could edit. But there was very, very little editing time. We did the programs as you saw them, more or less. There wasn't so they said there wasn't the sort of money to pay for editing. It was quite expensive to edit video tape in those days for some reason. So we literally had to do them as the program, and that was that. And of course we had singers in the program as well. The most famous ones, we had different groups to begin with, but the ones that people remember are Jane, Rod and Freddie, and they produced amazing. We did over 1,000 programs over the years, and they produced a song for each program. So you can imagine, it was quite something for them. And they would sing a song related to the theme of the program, and they also appeared in the programs too. Not every program, but most, a few of them they did, and they became, we became a sort of very popular program. Apart from the other companies, of course, produced their own preschool programs as well. So originally we were on 5 days a week, just at lunchtime when the nurseries finished. We'd be on at 12:30 or something like that, and sometimes I think eventually we were repeated around 4:00 or something like that in the afternoon, which was very nice. And then in the summer they repeated a whole series, which was very nice because we got lovely repeat fees, which was great while we weren't actually working in the summer, because that's when they were rewriting the next series. And as I say, I was originally booked for the 6 weeks, but then literally as the last week came of that first 6 weeks, we were I was asked, would you stay on? We've got another series starting in the October. No, I think it would have been in the spring of the following year, because I think I started in October time. So it would have been the next year. But it was, and as I say, it went on, as I say, with Thames Television till 1992, and then I carried on doing Rainbow till 95, when we stopped doing the sort of regular Rainbow programs. But since then, Zippy got so popular that I appeared in so many different guest appearances in various television comedy shows, and we did commercials. I did a commercial for Marmite. You either love it or you hated it, and Zippy hated it, which was great. And I remember recording the zip sound of Zippy's zip. They wanted to really get that, so it's really strong, a loud noise, zoom, as he, I think he actually zipped himself up then. He couldn't stand the thought of eating the Marmite thing. But we did lots of stuff, and as I say, it still goes on today. It's as I say, I still get asked to do odd appearances, which is really nice. So it's great. And what is quite nice too is, as I say, I'm not a face of any particular program, it's the puppet that's the main thing, which is lovely. It's the character of the puppet that is been loved, and of course I'm totally different from Zippy. So there we go.
You love Marmite, right?
No, I don't. I'm not that different from Zippy, I must admit.
I see.
I have eaten it, but it's not my favourite. No, not really. No, I'm afraid I agree with Zippy there.
Yeah.
I'm one of the haters.
Now you have written a book called Zippy and Me that details your time on Rainbow. How did the idea to write a book come about?
Well, this was really charming. I mean, I had two authors. I was doing a season at the Little Angel Theatre, and two people came to see one of the shows, and they said, they want to see me afterwards. I thought, what's this? And it was a lovely couple called Duncan Barrett and Nuala Colby, and they said, look, we'd be very interested. Would you be interested in us writing your biography of your work? And I almost laughed. I thought, oh my goodness, but I'm not really well known enough to be. They said, well, what we do is we base it around your Zippy character, and I'm sure it'll be great. So, and I must admit, I suppose my ego then went, oh well, of course, that'll be lovely. and basically they came along, and we did over the last. Well, it's been about 4 years before this book has eventually come, in fact, as I say, it's being published very soon. And it took that long because what happened was we made a proposal, and sent it to various publishers, and the publisher says, well, it's all very nice, we love the character and everything, but I don't think there's that many, celebrity titles out there now that I don't think we'll publish. And this was all the sort of very big publishers. And eventually we found a publisher called Unbound, and they're a company that actually use quite well-known established authors, but also it's like a crowdfunding campaign. So basically people pay up front for the book that they like, and the author, obviously, I did a video with using Zippy and the various puppets that I used over the years, mostly the television ones, so that obviously the general public would know them a bit more, and that sold the book to people, and people, oh yes, I'd like to, I'll put my £10 in. So they pledged their £10, and after about 18 months, I had enough money for to have the book published, paying all the publisher's costs and all the rest of it. And so that was really exciting. The only trouble was we had about 6 months break while Duncan, who was also an author, he'd written biographies. For instance, he'd written a biography about the Second World War and the occupation of the Nazis in Guernsey and Jersey, and so that book had to be, and he had another publisher, and that book had to be out at a certain time, obviously for last year's 100th celebration or whatever it was of that period. So he had to finish that book or get that book done before we could sort of finalise my book. Anyway, to make a long story short, it's been this last year. It's been wonderful. I mean, last Christmas I had the cover, photo shoot, and then I had to look up loads of photographs because there's about maybe 20 pictures of me as a kid working puppets or coming over from Canada. I mean, it is sort of a biography of literally my start from. And also stuff that happened in my family as well. For instance, my father sadly left home, and at one point before he died when he was 16, but he left home for a year or so, and my mother was, had to sort of look after us, and he produced my half sister, which I didn't know about until the 80s. So that's all in the book, that story, how that all came about, and of course my work with Henson's, my work with Harry Corbett, who did this famous glove puppet show, which I mentioned a bit earlier, Sooty and Sweep. I worked with him and his son because Matthew was one of the singers on Rainbow. It's just turned out it's just a coincidence. And Harry Corbett had a rather serious heart attack. And this is in the 70s, and I was working again, at Thames, where this program was being made as well in the summer, and so I had a free break, free time, and I took over working this lovely character Sweep, the dog with his squeaky voice, and various other characters. So I worked with again with Harry Corbett, who was a puppeteer I'd seen as a kid on television doing the Sooty show. So I was incredibly, I say it's luck, but it was just amazing. It was an amazing time having worked with Jan Bussell and then Harry, and then of course the Hensons. That was an amazing time too, because they came over with the Muppet show, because they've obviously filmed it over here. And I had a friend who was also working on a preschool program called Pipkins, Nigel Plaskett, who's actually quite well known as a puppeteer over here, as far as has done a lot of work and continues to do quite a lot of work with the Henson Company too. Anyway, he suggested I came to the studios to see a Pipkins filming, but also he also said, well, actually on the same day, Jim and his company are filming the Muppet Show, and you could just walk across the studio. And of course, they had a slightly bigger studio than us. I might add the Pipkin studio, but of course they had a huge, really big studio, ATV in Elstree, where the Muppets were, and that was amazing to see puppeteers standing up, walking from set to set. Oh, extraordinary. And then creating their own voices. Jim didn't actually direct the piece, but he was very much in charge. It was wonderful. And of course, Frank and Jim and Dave Goltz and wonderful Richard Hunt, who was working there. I remember Richard was very much the sort of showman of all the team. The others were very involved in doing their thing, and he was very much sort of out there. And I remember him calling, and there was two of us. I had a friend with me, and we were sitting watching this, all agog, watching this amazing experience of these fabulous puppets. And he suddenly said, and Richard suddenly shouted out, Ronnie LaDreau, Zippy, come down here. And I thought, oh my goodness, And I remember, and he was charming, and we got, we met them briefly, all these wonderful people, and for somebody who's a great friend now, Louise Gold, who was the only English puppeteer working with the Muppet series in that time. So that was lovely. And then, of course, eventually I had a call, would you be interested in coming to audition for Labyrinth? We've got this amazing film. They'd already made Dark Crystal, the original, in the Elstree studios there. But, and by that time I was while Dark Crystal was being done, I was of course working on Rainbow and all of it. So I was very much connected with that, so there was no question that I would have anything to do with the Dark Crystal. But with the Labyrinth, it just so happened it coincided with the break from Rainbow, so I thought, marvelous. And I do remember I had a friend made me a sort of beaver puppet, and the idea was, and this is one of the first auditions I ever did, actually, fun enough. It was always like meeting people, and then by that time I'd done probably 10 years of Rainbow or something, maybe almost. Yes, it must have been, because I think it was in the 80s when we did Labyrinth. Anyway, I went along for this audition, and I do remember there was a whole group of young puppeteers, a lot of ones I didn't really know, but obviously absolutely knew every Muppet character, knew everything about the Hensons. I knew quite a lot, but I didn't, and I kept thinking, oh, they're bound to get it, because I don't know enough. They'll probably ask me questions about the characters, and I probably won't remember everything. I obviously knew the main characters, but some of the other ones they might do. But that wasn't the case at all. You could go along and either improvise something with a puppet or bring a little act, that 2-minute act or something, so that Jim and everybody could see. And I remember Jim was sitting there with a whole group of other people, and it was amazing. I thought, I just have to improvise something. So I went along and improvised with this I did a ghastly American accent. Oh, hi there, I'm the beaver. I did my silly little beaver voice, and I did this thing, and I thought it was the most terrible audition possible. I think I got a few chuckles. What was quite nice was that some of the Muppet puppeteers came over and improvised with my puppet, and then it was a sort of puppet that was a sort of Muppet-like puppet. A friend of mine had made it for me for this audition. I still have the puppet. He's looking a bit old now. He's over 30 years old. But anyway, I remember leaving that sort of rehearsal. It wasn't a rehearsal. It was a church hall in Hampstead. Anyway, I left there, and it's absolutely true. I walked down the road, and I sort of went, and screamed. I don't know why. I just felt the sort of, I don't know, the pressure suddenly caught to me, and I don't know what, luckily it wasn't the people in the street, but I think if they did, they'd find, well, what was going on with this poor guy? But anyway, about 2 days later, I got the call saying, yes, we'd like to use you as an extra puppeteer on Labyrinth, and of course, that was wonderful. And then suddenly walking into the studio, the Elstree studios, and seeing their amazing sets. I mean, for instance, the Goblin Village was huge, absolutely wonderful. And we were working goblins, and I think one of the first things we did was the Babe song, with little Toby Froud as the baby, and obviously oh gosh, I've forgotten his name. It's dreadful, sorry. The wonderful actor who played David Bowie, excuse me. We did that song with him throwing up babies, and we had all these goblins. I mean, it was very interesting. You sometimes see in some of the old clips that Brian Henson, of course, young then, was saying things like, well, we originally thought we'll have 20 puppeteers. They actually got 40 puppeteers in, because the scene was so much more expanded, and so there was lots of people. In fact, it was just an amazing experience doing that. I had a fairly heavy puppet, I remember, but I didn't mind. We spent days on, were doing shots and stuff, and we were background puppeteers, but as time went on, we were used to help, do an odd arm rod or something for one of the main puppeteers, which was lovely. And I don't know, it was just so exciting. Of course, we earned quite good money then too. And there are, in my book, getting back to Zippy and me, there are some pictures of me sitting on the throne, David Bat, the throne that is it Gerard? I always forget the name, the character that he played. Anyway, the baddie, and I was sitting on there holding up one of the goblins I operated in the film. In those days, puppeteers could take pictures, and nowadays you're not allowed to take any pictures. So I haven't got many pictures of some of the latter films that I've worked on. But since after that, I think it was Little Shop of Horrors more or less straight away, and I worked some of the sort of the reed or the vines, I think they were called, at the bottom of the plant, and that was very exciting. In fact, I loved working with Frank Oz. I did go for an audition with him, and I funny enough brought my marionette. I didn't know quite what he wanted. He said, "Oh, I started off with marionettes," because his parents were puppeteers, and I met them years later in where was it? We went to Michigan. The Little Angel Theatre played The Little Mermaid there, and his parents were running that festival. It was an amazing festival where I met a lot of the American puppet icons. Bill Baird was still alive. I met him briefly. Berth Tillstrom, and of course the Hensons were around there. It was very exciting suddenly seeing all these iconic American puppeteers and stuff. And we also went to Detroit to see the wonderful puppets in the museum there. So that was an exciting time. But getting back to Little Shop, it was lovely. He just said, "Oh, that's fine. We like what you do," or something. And he's, I mean, they're very different, Frank and Jim. But Frank was, probably slightly. I think I was less intimidated with Frank than I was with Jim. I think, he's just this iconic figure of. And he was a fairly shy, quiet person, really, and Frank was a bit more sort of gregarious, as it were. So that was the thing. But, we did an awful lot of work there. We're underneath doing the vines of the puppets, and as I say, there was a lot of us doing that, and I did do the legs of Mushnik when he was being eaten. I was playing with them one day, and they were just huge, great big sort of levers that worked and made it look as though he was kicking as it sort of went along. Oh, I did a little bit, but I'm very proud of it. These were sort of semi-close-ups, I was getting, thinking this is great. I did, I think it's 5 seconds, if that, of the plant dialing the phone to get Audrey to come into the shop to be eaten, basically, by the plant. And there's a lovely sequence where he's, and you just see the vine, the finger dialing the phone, and that was me for 3 seconds or something. But I would think, oh, that was me. I was able to do that. So, but no, I loved working on that film. I thought the set, and because I've been very lucky. I've worked on most of the major studios, the film studios, the iconic studios, in England, Pinewood. That was shot in Pinewood. Elstree, Ealing Studios, where a lot of the old English comedies were made, with, and that was really exciting. So I have, I've had an amazing time still doing it. I've worked after that was Muppet Christmas Carol. I did some background puppets on that, and that was lovely working with Michael Caine. What a delightful man. And we had this lovely scene, which I thought took much longer when I saw it recently with a friend. And I thought, oh, this is a lovely scene. The camera pulls back and you can see all our puppets. And it probably only takes about 5 seconds. It's the very end when he's having the meal with his whole character Scrooge has changed, and he's lovely. And I was working on, I think it was, if you're looking at the picture, it was sort of on the right. I think we had 2 characters, one character in each hand, just to keep them alive, really, while they were at the table eating, enjoying the meal. But in that take, so there was various takes during that, and he would sort of say, "You all right, chaps? How are you getting on? All right, lovely." And he would tell us funny jokes and stuff. Delightful man, absolutely lovely. No, and then I went on from that. I think it was after Little Shop. Muppet Treasure Island I did with Brian. That was Brian's first film as a director, and that was extraordinary to do. Did quite a lot of stuff on that. Did a little marionette sequence on that, which was nice. They said, "Oh, you've done, string puppets. You're quite well known for that. Come and you just choose the people you want." And it was literally the pirates jumping off the boat at one point. And again, it's a short sequence, but it took probably half a day to shoot. But it was fun to do. I've worked latterly. I've worked on Beauty and the Beast. That was the Disney version. I did some second unit shooting there. That was very interesting in the fact that it was all CGI work for the characters. I was Lumiere, the candlestick, and but they wanted to have a 3D image so that they could get the movement correct, sort of thing. And so I have a marionette that beautifully carved marionette, we took the hands off it, and I stuck candlestick. Well, they stuck. The props people were brilliant, and candlesticks with LED lights on, and the cables sort of went up the arms and sort of up onto a pack on my wrist, and then the lighting people could flicker, make them lighter or darker, whatever it was, dim them and flicker them. And I had one put on the puppet's head, so that sort of imitated Lumiere, and I extended the arms a bit so it looked more like a sort of candlestick, or a human candlestick. And I did several scenes on that, which was lovely. Although my puppet wasn't, you never saw my puppet in the end, but they used it as a guide for certain scenes on the film, and that was great fun. That was in Shepperton Studios again. and that was fairly recent. But I have worked on a series which I'm not allowed to talk about yet. But if I say the wonderful magic word of Netflix, you'll know probably what's going to happen. It's going to be shown on Netflix. I think I can say the date without saying the name, but I think it's the 30th of August it comes out on Netflix, and we're all terribly excited. And that was a lovely, lovely job to do. Again, working with friends again, Louise Gold and lots of other puppeteers and some lovely puppeteers, American puppeteers that we, hadn't seen for years. And certainly Kevin Clash, for instance, I hadn't seen for a long, long time. And, we knew each other, years ago, right from the Labyrinth days. So it's really nice to be involved in that. So that's that. And the book, it will be published, getting on to the book again, the book will be published on July the 25th. There are copies, it will be sold on Amazon, so hopefully American public and puppeteers, if they're really keen to read it, I hope, I think it's a good read. I mean, I've had 3 people who've had seen it already and said they couldn't put it down. I don't know whether they're thinking, oh, well, you're a nice chap, we'll say nice things, but I think actually they meant it, which was lovely. The social media is brilliant at sort of publicizing stuff, and so there we are.
I'm very excited to read your book, and I will put a link on the website to where people can find out more.
Thank you.
But as we wrap up here, I wanted to ask if you could go back and give one piece of puppetry advice to young Ronnie who's watching The Little Mermaid for the first time. What advice would you give? What advice would you give yourself?
Right. Okay. I suppose I'd say don't get too excited. I mean, I'm talking about young Ronnie here, and I used to get so excited and sort of, I want to do, and I'd be almost, I'd need to, have a glass of water to calm down, that excitement. I was so excited to watch. So I would say just be calm, particularly funny enough, with marionette operating, or any puppet operating, really. You don't, and I would put a puppet on and sort of waving it about, really in a ghastly way, what we call dolly waggling. In fact, I mentioned there's sort of a couple of chapters called dolly waggling or something. It was just a term I think the television people used to say, oh, here come the dolly wagglers, and I think, oh no, it's not like that. But that, in a sense, that's when you're overexcited, or so it's just such fun to do. And so I would say that try and keep calm and just milk in what you see. I mean, I did do that, I suppose. What advice? Other advice, don't ask too many questions. Your poor puppeteers, I bet I did. Poor John Wright must have thought, oh, I wish he'd shut up, because I'm a terrible chatterbox. And I think he probably thought, that would be, just save a count. I used to have friends who used to say, count 10 before you ask the next question. So pause. So I think that would be good advice for anybody that, for me. Otherwise, I don't think, I've never lost the enthusiasm. I hope it comes through on this interview, but I've never lost the enthusiasm for puppetry. I absolutely adore it and still do it. And luckily, I'm still fit enough to carry on doing it. As I say, I do quite a lot of film and commercial work, but I also love teaching, and this has been a joy too. And there's been some really a renaissance of puppetry in this country, certainly. And it's apart from the War Horse experience, which of course has been amazing, but the puppetry is now is used in so many mainstay theatres, certainly in opera, in ballet. We've got some fabulous creative people over here, and I know people come over and visit, and sort of are sort of flabbergasted at the use of puppets now in as I say, in mainstream theatre. It is at the moment having a renaissance. I hope too that we can bring back the art of the marionette a little bit too. There's something very special watching a marionette being operated really well. And I know, for instance, in this film that I'm not allowed to mention, I did a sequence there, and they were so pleased. I mean, the director was thrilled, and he was, and I was, as I say, a background artist even in that. But I mean, honestly, every day he would say, "Oh, hello, Ronnie, how are you? Isn't it wonderful?" And it was so lovely to feel part of the. And of course, I knew most of the puppeteers, but even so, that was lovely. And so I'm hoping that the sequence will be hopefully a little bit more than 5 seconds.
Well,
but you never know.
I'm excited to see it for sure.
Oh, good.
What has been the highlight of your puppetry career so far?
Wow, there's been several, really. I think probably performing right from the very beginning days, but performing my one-man show, my little kids show, and getting the feedback from the audience, the response to the audience. I'm a great audience person. I love, performing with puppets and getting that, I don't sort of say, hello, children, my name is Joey the Clown, what's your name, or anything like that. It's not that sort of feedback. It's the feedback that comes from a young kid that says, oh, excuse me, Dodo, you squirted water on my toe. Did I? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Oh, did I really? Well, I'm sure it can be wiped off with a cloth. And we can have a sort of this lovely sort of to and fro. And believe it or not, other kids will be quiet while they listen to this one child talking to the puppet. And then very sweetly, sometimes they put their hands up to speak because they're told in class that you're not supposed to talk out. And I can't see, of course. Right. But it's that thing where they really believe in the character, and in the character's really strong. That's something that I absolutely love. That's was a great, and I've learned that through the years. And I do that when I'm doing my talks, and I have this what I call my brilliant bag show, where I just bring a bag full of puppets and I just sit there. It's funny, as I say, when I first started puppets, it was always hidden. I never showed myself. Now I just sit there, a bit like we have a thing called circle time in nursery schools, but I do it to all ages. It's everybody. But I sit there and I have my bags, and I bring out the bag, and there's a Muppet type character, or there's a marionette, or there's like a Zippy puppet, obviously a Zippy puppet, and a Sooty and Sweet puppet, and all these various other puppets, and it's lovely to see. And I'm there, and yet they're not looking at me; they're looking at the puppet, because my concentration's at the puppet, and that's I just love that. But I think the greatest thing, there isn't one single thing. I think working with the Hensons, that first seeing the Labyrinth stage, and seeing the amount of money that was spent. We probably, the Little Angel probably all those years ago would probably only have enough, like the budget of say £1,000 for a big, which sounds like a fairly amount of money, but that's nothing compared to what was spent on a film production, and all the amount of workshop people and wranglers and people that there were so many people helping, and then there were just puppeteers operating puppets. That's they didn't have to do all the sweeping up or anything like that. They did their performance. That's what they were paid for, and that is very exciting. That was an exciting time. I love doing Rainbow, to be honest. That was lovely. It turned out to be such a long part of my life, and it's lovely that the public still love the character. I suppose it's a bit unusual that a character's been on the television for 20 years. That's a long period. You might get sort of 2 or 3 series of a puppet show, and then there's something else moves on. But it was so popular that it carried on. That length of time, and as I say, he still pops up in various things. So it is nice. I think that's probably it. I love writing this book. I just hope that people enjoy it. As I say, several people have said that how much they've enjoyed it. It's very. I think it's a nice, easy read. Hopefully it's not too much of a big ego trip for me. It's more of a sort of hopefully encouraging people to continue, with this amazing art of puppetry, and just by showing the various different things that I've worked on, that they'll be encouraged to maybe want to join in this mad world of puppetry, which is really exciting.
Well, again, I'm certainly excited to read it. I will have a link to it in the show notes for this episode. And Ronnie, I can't thank you enough for being on the show. It really was an inspiring interview, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, and thank you very much. And good luck to everybody out there who reads the book. I hope they enjoy it. And, do come and visit the Little Angel or me when they come to England if you want to. I'm very happy to meet people and chat too. So, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can't thank Ronnie LeDrew enough for being on this episode of Under the Puppet. I'll have links to Ronnie's website, his new book, The Little Angel Theater, that Marmite commercial he was talking about, and more in the show notes for this episode number 30, over at underthepuppet.com. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Under the Puppet. I welcome your feedback via email at hello@SaturdayMorningMedia.com or via Twitter, where you can find the show at username Under the Puppet. You can also find the show on Facebook by searching for Under the Puppet. I want to hear your suggestions for questions I should be asking and for future guests. Let me know who I should be talking to. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you next time right here on Under the Puppet. This episode of Under the Puppet featured music by Dan Ring and was edited by Steven Staver. Under the Puppet is a production of Saturday Morning Media and is made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who've gone to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up a monthly pledge for as little as $1 a month. Patrons get new episodes before they are released, behind-the-scenes information, and exclusive bonus content. If you'd like to support this show and the other fun content from Saturday Morning Media, become a patron. Head on over to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up your monthly pledge today. You can also tell a friend about the show or leave the show a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Under the Puppet is copyright 2019 Saturday Morning Media Grant Pachoco Executive Producer. All rights reserved. www.SaturdayMorningMedia.com.
You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.